Isaiah Sheridan had not spoken more than 20 words in a single day for 14 years, and he had come to regard that silence the way other men regarded their best horses, something earned, something precious, something he had no intention of giving up. The Sheridan Ranch sat on the eastern edge of Callaway County, Wyoming Territory, in the year 1882, and it spread across 400 acres of short-grass prairie that rolled toward a creek called Amber Run. The land was not beautiful in any soft or gentle way. It was beautiful the way a worn rifle stock was beautiful, all utility and age, marked by weather and use, uninterested in your opinion of it. The creek ran clean in spring, ran low in summer, and froze into a crooked silver scar every December without fail. The cattle were a mixed herd of longhorn crosses that Isaiah had built slowly over 10 years of careful trading, and the kind of stubborn patience that people either admired or found unnerving, depending on their temperament. Isaiah himself was 34 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall, with the kind of lean, ropey build that comes not from any deliberate exercise, but from simply working from before sunup to past sundown every day for more than a decade. His hair was dark brown, and his jaw carried 2 or 3 days of stubble as a permanent feature, since shaving required a mirror and looking in mirrors required a willingness to have opinions about your own face that Isaiah did not generally possess. His eyes were a color that shifted between gray and green depending on the light and his mood, which most people never noticed because he did not make a habit of looking directly at anyone long enough for them to study the phenomenon. He had come to Wyoming Territory in 1868 at the age of 20, fresh out of a war he had not wanted to fight and a family that had dissolved around it. His father had died at Chickamauga. His mother had died of grief and typhoid 6 months after the news arrived. His older brother Marcus had come home from the war, a different man entirely, hollow-eyed and prone to rages, and had lasted another 2 years before drinking himself into a ditch outside Chattanooga. Isaiah had buried Marcus on a Tuesday in October of 1867, sold what remained of the family's Tennessee holdings for enough money to buy a train ticket west and a decent horse in St. Louis, and he had ridden north and west until the land started feeling like something that had nothing to do with any of those graves. He had filed his claim, built his first structure, a single-room sod dwelling that he replaced board by board over the years with a proper timber-framed ranch house, and gone about the business of living in a manner that suited him, which was quietly, which was alone. His nearest neighbor to the west had been an elderly trapper named Amos Creel, who had a particular hatred of conversation, and who died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1874, leaving his 240-acre claim to no one in particular. The county land office had held it in patience for the better part of 8 years, and Isaiah had grown comfortable with the knowledge that the parcel sat empty and would likely continue to sit empty, because the soil there ran harder and the creek did not reach it, and practical men doing practical calculations generally passed it by. He had not counted on Olive Ralston. She arrived on a Wednesday in early April of 1882, and Isaiah only knew she had arrived because he rode the fence line between his property and the Creel parcel every week as a matter of habit, and he nearly rode his horse directly into her wagon. The horse, a gray gelding named Copperhead for no reason anyone had ever been able to satisfactorily explain, spooked sideways into a fence post, and Isaiah spent a tense 30 seconds convincing him that the world was not ending before he could look properly at what had caused the trouble. The wagon was a canvas-covered Studebaker with one wheel sitting at a slightly unhappy angle, and the woman standing beside it had her arms crossed and her chin up in the posture of someone who has encountered a significant problem and has decided to be annoyed at it rather than frightened. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with dark auburn hair that was currently escaping from beneath a wide-brimmed hat in several independent directions. She wore a gray traveling dress that had seen better weeks, and her boots were good quality but badly in need of resoling. She was looking at the wheel with an expression of focused displeasure. She was not looking at Isaiah at all. He sat on Copperhead for a long moment, waiting to see if she would notice him. She did not. She crouched down and examined the wheel hub with the focused attention of someone who suspects they already know the answer and is hoping to be wrong. "The pin is sheared," she said without looking up. Isaiah blinked. "Yes," he agreed, because it was. "I have a spare somewhere." She stood and brushed dust from her skirt and then looked at him directly for the first time. She had brown eyes, dark as good coffee, and they sized him up with an efficiency that he found briefly startling. "You are the neighbor to the east." "Isaiah Sheridan," he said, because that seemed to cover the question. "Olive Ralston." She pulled off her hat and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I have filed on the Creel parcel, 240 acres. I am aware that the soil runs hard away from the creek before you say it." Isaiah had not been about to say it. He had not been about to say anything. He watched her walk to the back of the wagon and begin moving crates with a methodical competence that suggested this was not the first time she had sorted through packed goods in an inconvenient situation. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Because the silence between them felt different from his usual silence, it felt like it was waiting for something which he did not care for. "Kansas," she said. "Before that, Ohio." "Before that, it gets complicated." She found what she was looking for, a metal pin wrapped in a piece of cloth, and held it up briefly in triumph before heading back to the wheel. "I know how to change it myself. You do not need to help." "I know," Isaiah said. He got down from Copperhead and helped her anyway because the axle needed lifting and that was a two-person job and there was no convenient reason not to. They worked in a silence that was, if he was being precise about it, not actually uncomfortable, which he found suspicious. When the wheel was secured and the wagon was sound again, Olive Ralston stood and looked east toward the timber-framed ranch house that was visible in the middle distance, and then she looked at her own property, which at the moment consisted of a flat expanse of last year's dead grass, a scrubby cottonwood stand along the property's south edge, and no structure of any kind. "I have a tent," she said. "April in Wyoming is cold," Isaiah said. "I am aware of that as well." She looked at him again with that direct, measuring gaze. "Thank you for the axle. It needed doing," he said. He rode back to his ranch, put Copperhead in the barn, fed the horses their evening measure, ate a supper of salt pork and cornbread standing at the kitchen counter the way he always did, and then sat on the porch in the blue late April dusk and told himself that the matter of Olive Ralston was none of his concern and that things would go on exactly as they always had. He almost believed it. He did not sleep well that night, which he attributed to the change in the wind that sometimes came before a late spring storm. He rose before dawn and did his morning chores in the dark the way he always did: horses, cattle count, fence check on the north pasture, and when the sun came up it was thin and cold, and there were clouds moving in from the northwest with the flat gray bottoms that meant business. By mid-morning it was snowing, not lightly. In Wyoming in April, when winter decided to make one last argument, it made it with full conviction, and by noon there were 4 inches on the ground, and the temperature had dropped to something that made his breath come out in solid white clouds. Isaiah stood on his porch and looked west toward the Creel parcel, and he could just make out, through the shifting curtain of snow, the dark shape of a canvas tent. He saddled Copperhead. He did not allow himself to think too much about why he was doing it, because thinking too much about why he was doing things had never served him particularly well. He rode to the tent through the snow, and when he arrived he found Olive Ralston inside it, wrapped in 2 blankets, trying to coax a small camp stove into producing a flame with fingers that had clearly passed the point of working properly. "The tent is not adequate," she admitted, without turning around. She seemed to have an uncanny ability to know when he was approaching, which he would later discover was simply a talent she had for listening. She paid attention to sounds the way most people paid attention to sights. "Come to the ranch house," Isaiah said. "That is a significant imposition." "The snow is not done yet," he said. She turned and looked at him. Her nose was red, and her fingers were white at the tips, and she had the expression of a woman doing rapid calculations about pride versus practical necessity. Practical necessity won, as it generally does when the temperature is involved. He helped her bring what she needed inside 2 bags, a wooden crate, the camp stove that he secured properly in the wagon bed so it would not set anything alight. Copperhead carried them both back through the snow in a patient manner that Isaiah privately appreciated, because the horse had more sense than to make things complicated. The ranch house was 4 rooms, a main room with a fireplace and a table, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a small room that Isaiah used for storage and mending. He cleared enough space in the storage room for a cot and spare blankets, and said nothing about the fact that this was the most use the room had ever been put to. Olive Ralston moved through his house with a careful, respectful tread, the way someone does when they understand they are a guest in a space that belongs entirely to someone else. She did not rearrange things or comment on the way he kept his shelves, or ask any of the questions about his life that he was expecting and steeling himself against. Instead, she sat at his kitchen table when he offered her coffee, held the mug in both hands until her fingers worked again, and said, "Tell me about the soil. You said the hard pan runs through the Creole land. How deep does it go?" Isaiah sat across from her and told her what he knew. He had done test digs along his fence line over the years, had a general sense of the stratigraphy. He told her about the cottonwood stand and its implications for subsurface water. He told her about the wind patterns that came through the gap in the hills to the northwest and what they did to unprotected structures in January. She listened with complete attention and asked precise questions, and he found himself talking more than he had talked in a very long time, which should have alarmed him but somehow did not. The snow lasted 2 days. It deposited 8 inches and then departed with the casual indifference of Wyoming weather, and by the 3rd morning the sky was the specific brilliant blue that only exists after a late spring storm has scoured everything clean. Olive gathered her things with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, and thanked him with a directness that had no performance in it. "I owe you," she said. "You do not," Isaiah said. She looked at him for a moment with those dark coffee eyes, and then she nodded once, as if he had passed some test he had not been aware of taking, and she walked back to her property to begin the considerable work of building a life on hard ground. He watched her go from the porch and then went back inside and told himself, with less conviction than before, that things would go on exactly as they always had. They did not. The difficulty was that Olive Ralston turned out to be both industrious and, as near as he could tell, entirely without fear, which produced a combination of results that made it increasingly impossible to simply ignore her existence. Within the first week, she had identified the 4 spots on her property, where the hardpan ran shallowest, and begun digging a well at the most promising. Within the 2nd week, she had contracted with a timber merchant in the town of Callaway Cross, 12 miles east, to deliver lumber for a structure. Within the 3rd week, she had the frame of a small house rising from the ground with the help of 2 day laborers from town. Isaiah did not go over to help. He told himself this was because she had made it clear she was managing on her own, and he respected that. He told himself it had nothing to do with the fact that watching her work made him feel obscure and complicated feelings, that he did not have an organized system for handling. On the 1st Saturday of May, he rode into Callaway Cross for his monthly supply run, and he was loading flour and salt and lamp oil into his wagon bed, when the man behind him at the mercantile counter said, conversationally, to the merchant, "You hear about the woman who filed on the Creole land. They say she is a widow out of Kansas. Husband died of the fever 2 years back. Left her with nothing, or near enough. My cousin says she bought the claim with money she saved from working in a hotel." The merchant made a non-committal sound. "Brave thing for a woman alone," the man continued, or foolish, hard to say which out here. Isaiah paid for his goods without commenting, because commenting on other people's business was not something he did. But the information settled into him the way water settles into ground, not noisy, not dramatic, but present and reshaping things at a level below visibility. She was a widow. She had come here with hotel wages and determination, and no other resources that anyone seemed to know of. She was building a house with 2 hired hands and her own 2 hands, and the stubborn intention that was apparently her fundamental nature. He rode home with something sitting on his chest that he could not name, and he was not going to try. The beginning of their regular contact happened because of a cow. One of Isaiah's longhorn crosses, a red-end white heifer that he had been calling, mentally, the troublesome one for 2 years because she had a talent for finding gaps in fences, found a gap in the fence between his property and Olive's, and wandered through it on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-May. Isaiah discovered her absence during his evening count, tracked the missing heifer by following the impressions in the soft spring ground, and found her standing in Olive Ralston's partially completed vegetable garden looking pleased with herself among the wreckage of several recently planted rows. Olive came out of her house, which was roofed but not yet sided, holding a lantern, and looked at the cow and then at Isaiah. "She ate my onion sets," Olive said. "I will replace them," Isaiah said, "and my potato starts. Those too." Olive looked at the cow, who was regarding them both with the blank contentment of an animal that has had a good day. "She has done this before," she said. "It was not a question." "She has a gift for it," Isaiah admitted. Something shifted in Olive's face, and he realized she was suppressing a laugh. It was a very small suppression, barely visible, but he caught it because he had already, without fully authorizing himself to do so, learned the geography of her expressions well enough to notice changes in them. "Stay for supper," she said, as if this followed naturally from the conversation they had been having, which it did not, unless you were tracking a different conversation running underneath the spoken one. He should have said no. He had said no mentally before she had finished saying the word supper. But what came out of his mouth was, "All right." She had a camp stove set up inside the house, which smelled of fresh-cut pine and wood shavings, and she made him a meal of salt pork and beans with cornbread that was better than his own, which he ate at a makeshift table of boards and sawhorses while she sat across from him with her own plate, and they talked. Or rather, she talked, and he listened and occasionally spoke, which he discovered was actually a functional and pleasant way to have a conversation. She told him about Kansas. Her husband had been a farmer named Robert Ralston, a decent man, she said, with the specific quiet loyalty of someone telling the honest truth about a person rather than building a monument. They had been married 3 years when the fever took him. She had waited 2 more years to be certain she was thinking clearly before she made any large decisions, and then she had made this one. She had looked at land in Kansas, in Nebraska, in Colorado, and had finally come to Wyoming because the price was right and the space was what she needed. "What do you intend to do with 240 acres of hard ground?" Isaiah asked. "Sheep," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said, with the air of someone who has had this reaction before. "But the wool price is strong and sheep manage on rougher ground than cattle. I have an arrangement with a sheepman in Laramie. He will sell me a starter flock on credit, 30 ewes and 3 rams, and I will build from there." It was, Isaiah recognized, a coherent plan. Sheep were not popular among cattle ranchers, which was putting it mildly. There was a general and sometimes violent sentiment in the ranching community that sheep ruined grazing land, poisoned water sources with their hooves, and represented a general assault on the natural order of things, which sentiment was largely exaggerated but felt very strongly. He mentioned none of this because she clearly already knew it. "Your neighbors may not welcome that," he said. "You are my nearest neighbor," she said, and looked at him. "I know," he said. "And are you going to tell me I cannot do it?" "It is your land," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, and then she said, "You are not what I expected." What did you expect? I expected more argument, she said. People in general provide a great deal more argument. Argument takes effort, Isaiah said, and it seems like a waste of it. She laughed at that, a real laugh, not the suppressed one from the garden, but an open, unguarded sound that filled the empty roof space around them and did something peculiar to Isaiah's chest. He looked down at his cornbread and concentrated very intently on it for a moment. He walked home that night in the spring dark with Copperhead on a lead rope and the troublesome one sulkily following behind, and he stood at his porch for a while looking at the lights in Olive's incomplete house, and he was honest enough with himself in the privacy of the dark to acknowledge that something was happening. He was not certain what to do with that acknowledgement, so he put it carefully to one side and went to bed. May became June. The grass on both properties went from brown to the particular green that Wyoming grass turns when it decides to be serious about living. Isaiah mended the fence section where the troublesome one had made her escape. Using extra wire and a post he set 8 inches deeper than regulation depth, and for good measure, he also mended the 2 other sections on the western fence line that showed signs of weakness, because thoroughness was its own argument. Olive's house acquired its siding. The sound of hammer and nails rang across both properties in the mornings, sometimes joined by the sound of her singing to herself. She had a low, clear voice that carried on still air, and she seemed to sing when she was working alone and forgot she might be heard, which meant she never sang when he was nearby, which he found he minded more than he should. He began finding reasons to be near the fence line. He told himself this was because the fence needed regular attention, which was true, but had never previously required him to check it every other day. He told himself he was monitoring the wind gap situation in the Northwest Hills for practical reasons. He told himself many sensible and unconvincing things, and while he was telling them to himself, he was slowly, incrementally, without any formal decision ever being made, spending more time in the proximity of the woman on the neighboring claim. The sheep arrived in mid-June. Olive had hired a man from town named Clarence Webb to drive them from Laramie, and the flock came down the road in the early afternoon of a Thursday in a cloud of dust and noise. 30 ewes and 3 rams moving in their particular sheep fashion, bunched and nervous, and making the sound that sheep make, which Isaiah privately thought was one of the more ridiculous sounds in the natural world, but which he supposed he could grow accustomed to. He was mending a section of his north pasture fence when they arrived, which was a coincidence, more or less. He watched from a careful distance as Olive directed the flock through the gate she had built in the south corner of her property, her arms spread wide, her hat knocked sideways in the effort, her voice calm and authoritative in a way that the sheep seemed to respond to, despite the fact that sheep responding to authority is generally considered a myth. Clarence Webb looked relieved when the gate was shut. Olive looked triumphant. She saw Isaiah watching from the fence line and waved once, quickly, the wave of someone who has her hands full but wants to acknowledge that you exist. He raised his hand back. That evening she came to his fence and called his name, and he went over. "They are here," she said unnecessarily, with a satisfaction in her voice that was warm and full and made him think of things he had not allowed himself to think about in a very long time. "I see that," he said. "They have good fleece," she said. "The sheepmen in Laramie showed me the records. The ewes are from a Spanish Merino cross. The wool is fine grade." She was talking quickly, the way she talked when she was pleased about something, words coming a little faster and brighter than usual. "By autumn I should have a clip worth selling. Not a big one the first year, but enough to make a payment on the credit." "How long does that give you?" Isaiah asked. "Before the payment is due?" 18 months, she said, "but I would rather make it in 6. He did not doubt that she would. "You said you had water on the south side," he said, thinking practically because practically was where he could be useful. "The sheep will need access, but you will want to protect the bank. They will cut it up if you let them have free access." She nodded, absorbing this, filing it away. This was something he had noticed about her. She took information seriously, without argument, when it was practical information offered in good faith. She did not feel the need to already know everything. It was a quality he found unusual and, if he was being honest, moving. "I will put in a rock apron along the bank," she said. "I saw you do that along Amber Run." He looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," she said, and looked back at him with a directness that was by now familiar and still did something confusing to his composure. He started helping her in July, and the thing about it was that it happened so gradually and naturally that there was never a specific moment he could point to and say, "That is when I decided to stop keeping to myself." He helped her set fence posts for a new sheep paddock, because he had the post hole digger and she did not. He helped her haul rock from the creek bed for the bank reinforcement because his horse was stronger than hers, a brown mare she called Margaret who was game but not large. He showed her where on her property the hardpan ran thin enough that a kitchen garden might actually produce, and she planted there, and it did. In return, and she always made sure there was a return, which was a form of pride he recognized and respected, she cooked for him on the evenings he helped. Her cooking was considerably better than his own, which she never mentioned, and he never pretended not to notice. She made things he had not tasted in years: proper biscuits, dried apple pie, a venison stew that used herbs she had growing in tin cans on her kitchen windowsill. He ate these meals at her board table, which she had built herself from timber salvage, and he began to understand that the evenings were the thing he was working toward when he worked toward anything at all. The other ranchers in Callaway County noticed the sheep, as was inevitable. The closest of them, a florid, broad-faced man named Garfield Prout, who ran 800 cattle on a large spread to the south, rode over to Olive's property in the third week of July, with two of his hands flanking him and his face arranged in an expression of concerned reasonableness that had nothing reasonable in it. Isaiah happened to be there. He was helping Olive repair a gate hinge, and he looked up at the sound of the horses and assessed Prout's expression and quietly put down the wrench he was holding and stood up. "Miss Ralston," Prout said. He had not apparently noticed or did not care that he was using a title that was incorrect. She was Mrs. Ralston, widow or not, and she noticed, though she said nothing. "I hear you have brought sheep onto the Creole land." "You hear correctly," Olive said. "That land borders summer grazing I have used for 15 years, Prout said. "Sheep will foul the water and ruin the grass for my cattle." "This land is my property," Olive said steadily. "Filed legally and held in good standing. What I run on it is my decision." Prout looked at Isaiah. "Sheridan, you are all right with this woman running sheep next door to you?" "It is her land," Isaiah said. Prout's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "I would encourage you to reconsider, ma'am," he said to Olive, in the tone of a man who uses the word encourage to mean something else entirely. "The ranching community in Callaway County has certain ways of doing things." "I am familiar with the ways of ranching communities," Olive said, "and I am familiar with the law regarding legal land holdings. Good afternoon, Mr. Prout." Prout held his position for a moment, his horses shifted and his men looked at each other, and then he turned and rode south, and his men rode with him, and Isaiah watched them go until the dust settled. "He will not let it alone," Isaiah said. "I know," Olive said. She picked up the wrench and handed it back to him. "Shall we finish the gate?" He fixed the gate. But he was thinking about Prout for the rest of the afternoon, because he knew Garfield Prout in the way you know a man you have lived in the same county with for a decade, not well, but well enough to know that when Prout said he would encourage you, he meant it as a beginning, not an end. August came with its full weight of heat, and Callaway Cross baked under a white sky, while Amber Run ran lower than Isaiah had seen it in 3 years. He deepened Olive's well by another 6 feet during a hot week in mid-August, working down in the shaft while she managed the rope and bucket at the top, the two of them calling back and forth in the practical shorthand they had developed, which was efficient, and also the thing he looked forward to most in his days, which he acknowledged to himself and continued to say nothing about. On the Friday evening of the third week of August, he was walking home along the fence line in the cooling dusk when she called his name from her porch. He stopped and turned, and she was standing there with the particular stillness she sometimes had, her hands clasped in front of her, the orange light of the setting sun making her hair look like it was on fire. "Isaiah," she said. She had started using his name in the middle of July, and each time she did it he felt it like a note struck on a tuning fork. "Yes," he said. "Why do you help me?" He did not say anything for a moment, because this was the question he had been not asking himself for 3 months, and hearing it out loud from her was like walking into a room he had been circling. "Because it needs doing," he said, which was true as far as it went. She came down the 2 steps from the porch and walked to the fence and stood on the other side of it, about 4 feet from him, looking at him with the directness that was simply her way but that had accumulated weight over the weeks. "That is what you said about the axle in April," she said. "The first day. It is still true. You helped me through a snowstorm," she said. "You replaced my potato starts and my onion sets. You dug 6 feet deeper into my well. You have mended my fences and taught me where the water runs on this property and been present every time someone has seemed inclined to be threatening about my sheep." She paused. "That is more than what needs doing." Isaiah looked at the fence rail between them, a weathered gray board that needed painting. He put his hand on it. "I know," he said. "Then why?" He looked up at her. "Olive," he said, using her name the way she used his carefully with weight behind it, and then he stopped, because the words that came next were words he had not spoken in 14 years, and the architecture of not speaking had become structural, had become load-bearing, and he could feel the effort of taking it apart even just enough to let something through. "I was married," he said. "Before. In 1867. Her name was Clara. She died of a fever before the year was out." He said this without looking away from her because whatever this was, it did not deserve to be said to the ground. After that I decided silence was easier. Olive did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "What changed?" "You came onto the neighboring claim," he said, "and ruined the whole arrangement." Something happened in her face, a shift, a dissolving of a particular careful composure she maintained the way he maintained his silence, and she laughed. But it was not quite a pure laugh. It had water in it, and she pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth and then let her hand fall. "I am sorry," she said, "about Clara. It was a long time ago," he said. "And I am not sorry," she added, "about ruining the arrangement." He looked at her over the fence rail. "Neither am I," he said, "I think." She smiled at that, a slow, real, unguarded smile that he had never seen full on before, he realized, because she had always partially turned away from him in a moment like this, the way people turn from something bright. She was not turning away now. "Come to supper tomorrow," she said. "All right," he said. He walked home in the dark, and the stars were enormous the way they only are in a country with no other lights for 30 miles in any direction. And he put Copperhead in for the night and stood on his porch for a while, and it was the most alive he had felt since Clara, and he let himself feel it without argument. September brought 2 things. The first wool clip of the season, smaller than Olive had planned but better quality than she had hoped, and the news that Garfield Prout had filed a complaint with the county land office claiming that Olive's sheep were fouling the shared watershed. The complaint had no legal merit, her sheep were not on his land, and the watershed complaint was the kind of thing that men with lawyers threw at homesteaders to see if the paper alone would drive them off. But it meant she would need to appear before the land commissioner in Callaway Cross to answer it. Isaiah went with her. He did not ask if she wanted him to come. He simply appeared at her gate on the morning of the hearing, mounted on Copperhead, and she looked at him from her own horse Margaret, brushed and presentable for the occasion, and said, "Thank you." "Someone should be there who knows the land," he said, which was practical and also not the whole truth. The land commissioner was a small, careful man named Hendricks who was not corrupt exactly, but who was attentive to the opinions of the established ranching community in ways that were not always balanced. He heard Pruitt's complaint, read by Pruitt's lawyer in a voice designed to sound reasonable and authoritative, and then he heard Olive's response, delivered by Olive herself, who stood at the front of the small commissioner's office with her hands flat on the table and laid out the facts of her land, her water rights, and the creek bank improvements she had made. With a precision and calm that made Hendricks look uncomfortable in the way that people look uncomfortable when they realize the argument they expected to be easy is not going to be easy. Isaiah, when called to speak as an adjacent landowner and someone with knowledge of the watershed, described the creek's behavior over 14 years with the detailed accuracy of a man who has watched something carefully for a long time and remembered what he saw. He noted that the water quality on his own land had not changed since Olive's sheep arrived, and offered to provide records of the bank reinforcement work if records were needed. Hendricks dismissed Pruitt's complaint. Pruitt sat in the back of the commissioner's office with his big hands on his knees and his face that dark red color that heavy men get when they are angry, and when Isaiah and Olive walked out into the September sunlight, Isaiah was careful to note where Pruitt's men were standing. "He will try something else," Isaiah said. "Let him try," Olive said. She sounded tired under the confidence, the way a person sounds when they are keeping up a front for practical reasons and only let down the edges of it when they think no one is measuring. He was measuring. "We should eat something," he said, "before the ride home." She looked at him. "We should," she agreed. They ate in the one restaurant in Callaway Cross, a narrow room behind the mercantile that served a reasonable stew and passable coffee, and they sat across from each other the way they had been sitting across from each other for months now, and the conversation moved from the hearing to the wool clip to whether she could manage a greenhouse structure for the winter to protect her herb plants, and somewhere in the middle of this entirely practical discussion, Isaiah became aware that they were sitting very close together at a small table, because the restaurant had filled up, and that her hand was near his on the tabletop, and that he was looking at her hands and thinking about them with an specificity that was not practical at all. "Isaiah," she said. He looked up. "You are staring at the table," she said, but her voice had a softness in it. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" He looked at her directly, the way he had learned to look at her over the summer without deflection. "About how much I look forward to supper," he said. "Every evening, how I think about it all day." The noise of the restaurant went on around them. Olive looked at him steadily, and the careful composure was entirely gone now. "So do I," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, just a moment, just the weight of his hand on hers, warm and deliberate, and then he moved it back, because they were in a restaurant in a small town and there were eyes, and also because he was a man who moved slowly and meant what he did, and he wanted what was happening between them to be solid, not rushed. But she turned her hand over before he moved his and held it, palm up, open, for just a second, and he felt that openness in his chest like a door coming off its hinges. They rode home in the long golden afternoon, side by side at an easy pace, and they did not talk much, which was comfortable in the particular way that silence is comfortable between people who have stopped being afraid of what silence might mean. October brought Pruitt's next move, which was uglier than a land complaint. On a Monday morning in the second week, Isaiah found his fence cut along the western line not accidentally, not weathered through, but cut cleanly with wire cutters at 3 separate posts, and 20 of Olive's sheep inside his north pasture. He could hear her calling for them from her property, that calm and authoritative voice going hoarse with the effort. He rounded the sheep himself, all 20, and drove them back through the gap, and he was repairing the fence with new wire when Olive appeared, breathing hard from the search. "Pruitt," she said. "Most likely," he said. "I cannot prove it." "The cut is clean," she said, looking at it. "Wire cutters, it was deliberate." "Yes," he said. "If my sheep had gotten into your cattle," she stopped herself. Mixed sheep and cattle herds were not a danger exactly, but in a county where the ranching sentiment ran strongly anti-sheep, a finding of mixed herds would be used against her. That was the design of it. They did not, Isaiah said. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the repaired fence, and he could see the calculation running behind her eyes, the money she had, the credit she owed, the opposition ranged against her, the winter coming, and all of it on 240 acres of hard ground that she had bet everything she had on. "I am not leaving," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I am aware this causes you problems as well." "If he is cutting your fence because you support me, Olive," he said. She stopped. "I am aware of the situation," he said. "I am choosing to be in it." She looked at him for a moment, and then she walked the 3 steps to where he was standing, and she looked up at him at close range and said, quietly, "Why are you doing this?" "Because I care what happens to you," he said. "Very much." The wind moved through the grass between them, and she reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood like that in the October morning sun for a long moment, and then she came up on her toes and kissed him, brief and warm and certain, and he kissed her back, and it was like the sound of amber run after the thaw, ordinary and miraculous at once. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her. Her chin was up. She looked like she had made a decision and had no interest in apologizing for it. "Good," he said, which was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said, but it was true and she knew it. And she smiled, and it was the full, unguarded smile, and he thought about 14 years of silence and what they had cost him and what they had been worth, and decided the accounting came out somewhere complicated and acceptable. He rode to Callaway Cross that afternoon and spoke to the county sheriff, a man named Tom Baird, who was generally practical and fair, and reported the fence cutting. Baird came out the following day, looked at the cuts, looked at the wire, made notes. He rode to Pruitt's ranch, and Isaiah was not there for that conversation, but 2 days later he received word through Baird that Pruitt had expressed ignorance of any fence cutting and had emphasized his position as an established member of the county ranching community. "Which means he did it and knows we cannot prove it," Isaiah said. "Which means that," Baird agreed. "But it also means he knows we are watching. He is a careful man in some ways. He will try something that cannot be traced to him," Isaiah said. "Probably," Baird said. "Keep your eyes open." Isaiah kept his eyes open. He also, quietly and without making an announcement of it, began spending his nights alternating, one night at his own ranch, one night sleeping in his wagon on Olive's property, within sight of the sheep paddock. He brought Copperhead and his rifle, which was a Winchester model 1873 that he had maintained carefully and used rarely, and he sat in the wagon bed in the cold October nights with the stars overhead and listened. Olive discovered this on the 3rd night when she came out before dawn and found his wagon in her yard. She stood in the lantern light in her coat, looking at the wagon and at him, and he looked back. "You did not tell me you were doing this," she said. "I did not want to worry you," he said. "Isaiah Sheridan," she said. "I have been worried. I have been lying awake listening for sounds in the paddock every night for a week." "I know," he said. "That is why I am here." She stood for a moment in the dark and the lantern light, and then she said, "Come inside, I will make coffee." He came inside. She made coffee. They sat at her board table in the pre-dawn dark and drank it, and Olive was very quiet for a while, and then she said, "When I lost Robert, I decided I was finished needing people. It seemed safer." "Yes," he said. He understood this precisely. "It is harder to maintain than you might think," she said. "Considerably," he agreed. She looked at him over her coffee mug. "I am glad you are here," she said. "Not just tonight." "So am I," he said, and he meant it with a completeness that would have surprised the version of him who had ridden that fence line 14 months ago in a silence he had thought was permanent. The attempt, when it came, was not fence cutting. On a Thursday night near the end of October, someone set fire to the brush pile at the edge of Olive's south paddock, the one where she had been stacking cleared scrub in anticipation of a proper burning day. It was a dry autumn and the fire moved fast, and if Isaiah had not been in the wagon and awake and smelled it before the glow was visible, it might have taken the paddock fence and possibly the sheep. Instead, he was up and running before he was fully awake, grabbing the bucket from the wagon and screaming for Olive, whose light came on in the window within seconds because she had not been sleeping either. They fought the fire together with buckets from the water trough, Isaiah beating at the edges with a grain sack, while Olive worked the bucket line with a speed and steadiness that he would think about for years afterward. The fire was contained in 40 minutes. By the time it was out, they were both gray with ash and breathing hard, and the paddock fence stood intact and the sheep were bunched in the far corner of the paddock, frightened but whole. Isaiah walked the perimeter of the fire site in the dark. He found the origin point, a pile of dry grass that had been arranged deliberately beneath the brush pile's windward edge, and near it, half buried in the soil, a matchbook of the type sold at the Mercantile in Callaway Cross. He brought it to Olive. She held it in her palm and looked at it. "Take it to Baird," she said. He did the following morning, and Baird took it seriously this time, because a fence cutting could be accident or misattribution, but an arson fire on a woman's property was something else. He went to Pruitt's ranch again with a deputy, and this time the conversation was longer, and the deputy noted that Pruitt's boots carried a particular type of red clay soil that matched the soil type at the origin point of the fire, which was not common in the area. Garfield Pruitt did not go to jail. The evidence was circumstantial, and his lawyer was the better kind. But he was informed in explicit terms by Sheriff Baird that any further incidents on or affecting the Ralston property would result in serious consequences, and that the sheriff had made a personal and professional note of his interest in the matter. Pruitt's bluster and his color were both elevated when he came out of that meeting, but he was, as Baird had said, a careful man in some ways. He left Olive's property alone after that. November arrived, and with it the cold that was a different species of cold from April, not a temporary argument but a settled fact that would last until March. Olive's house was tight and warm, the stove she had ordered from Cheyenne installed against the back wall of the main room and drawing well. Her sheep were in their winter paddock, supplemented with hay she had bought from a feed merchant, and her wool clip had sold for a price that paid down a third of what she owed the sheepmen in Laramie. Isaiah invited her to Thanksgiving supper. This was the first time he had cooked for anyone in 14 years, a fact he acknowledged only internally, and he spent 2 days planning and 1 full day executing a meal that was not elegant but was genuine. A prairie chicken he had shot and roasted, biscuits, a sweet potato dish he had learned from a cook in Chattanooga long ago, dried fruit pudding. He set the table with a tablecloth he found at the bottom of a chest where it had sat unused since Clara had packed it there in the summer of 1867, and he looked at it for a long time before he put it on the table. He chose to put it on the table. Olive arrived in the late afternoon with a bottle of apple cider she had purchased in town and a pie she had made from dried currants, and she stood in the doorway of his ranch house and looked around at the lit lanterns and the laid table and the tablecloth and said nothing for a moment. "It is very good," she said. "The tablecloth." "It has been in a chest," he said. "Clara's." "I know," she said. She came in and set the cider and the pie on the counter and turned to face him. "Thank you for taking it out." He looked at her. "Thank you for coming," he said. They ate supper in the warmth of the ranch house, with the wind coming down from the northwest hills outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, and they talked and were quiet and talked again. And he told her more about Clara than he had told anyone about the year in Tennessee, about the brief and genuine happiness of those months, about the specific quality of the loss, which had been not just grief, but a kind of structural failure. As if the life he had imagined had collapsed at its foundation, and he had not been able to see how to build another one in its place. He told her that coming west had been less a plan than a direction, less a decision than a fall. "Until the claim," she said. "Until the claim," he agreed. "The land gave me something to do, And when I arrived on the neighboring claim, she asked, with the small light in her eyes that she got when she was teasing him. "You gave me considerably more to do," he said. Laughed, and he smiled genuinely and fully, which was something he had been doing more frequently and which still felt slightly unfamiliar, like a muscle relearning a movement, and they sat long after the food was done, talking by the fire, and when she finally put on her coat to go home, he walked her back to her gate in the cold, clear November dark, and they stood at the fence the way they often did, and she looked up at him. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think we should stop doing this," she said. He went still. Not that she made a gesture that encompassed both of them and the months behind them. Not that, I mean the fence, the standing on separate sides of it. "I think we should stop." He looked at the fence rail between them. "I think so too," he said. She reached across and put her hand in his, and he held it, and the night was cold and enormous around them, and he felt, with a clarity he had not expected, that this was right. That this was the thing that the 14 years had been somehow traveling toward without his knowledge or consent, which was perhaps the thing about life he had most consistently failed to account for, that it moved whether you were moving with it or not, and that sometimes the only difference was whether you were paying attention. He kissed her at the fence, properly this time both hands, and she kissed him back with the directness and warmth that was simply who she was, and the stars above Callaway County were cold and immense and completely indifferent, and it did not matter at all. He proposed to her in December, on a Sunday afternoon, standing in her kitchen while she was checking on bread rising near the stove. He was sitting at the board table with his coffee, and he said, without preamble, "Olive, I want to marry you." She looked up from the bread. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are very direct," she said. "It seemed to match the occasion," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it matches the occasion, or yes, you will marry me." "Both," she said. He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen, and she stood straight and looked up at him with those dark coffee eyes that he had been looking into for 8 months now, and he took her face in both hands, and she put her hands on his chest, and they stood like that for a moment, just being certain of each other, and then he kissed her forehead and she closed her eyes. "I have a ring," he said. "It was Clara's. I want you to know that before I show it to you, and I want you to tell me if you would rather have a different one." She opened her eyes. "May I see it?" He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small ring, a gold band with a small garnet set in a simple pronged setting, old-fashioned and plain and honest. He held it out on his palm. Olive looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "Clara had good taste," she said. "I would be honored to wear it." He put it on her finger. They were married in March of 1883, in the small Methodist church in Callaway Cross, in a ceremony attended by Sheriff Baird and his wife, the merchant from the general store and his family, 2 of Olive's day laborers who had become something like friends, and a surprising number of the ordinary working people of Callaway County, who had quietly followed the story of the woman with the sheep on the Creel land, and found themselves interested in how it turned out. Garfield Prout was not there. The Reverend was a thin, earnest man who took his vows seriously, and he looked at Isaiah and Olive and said the words with the weight they deserved. And when Isaiah said "I do," he said it in the voice of a man who has thought about those words and knows exactly what he is committing to. Olive said them looking straight at him, clear and direct and completely herself, and he thought, "There is no one else alive who is quite like this woman," which was both an observation and a form of prayer. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall with food brought by half the congregation and apple cider and someone's fiddle, and Isaiah stood against the wall with his bride and watched people talking and laughing, and thought that the last time he had been surrounded by this much sound was before the war, and that it was, to his genuine surprise, something he could tolerate and even, in small and private ways, appreciate. Olive danced with the merchant's wife and with Sheriff Baird, who turned out to be a reasonable dancer for a man his size, and she looked happy in the open and unguarded way that he was still learning to see fully, and he looked at her and could not stop looking at her, which he suspected was going to be a permanent condition. They rode home together in the March afternoon, to the ranch, his ranch, which she was moving into, though they had agreed that she would keep the deed to her claim and continue the sheep operation, because it was hers and it was working, and because Olive Ralston, Olive Sheridan now, though she said the change would take some getting used to, was not a woman who gave up things she had built. She moved her things into the ranch house, and they rearranged it together, making space for her books on the single shelf, for her herbs in their tin cans on the kitchen windowsill, for the particular organized system she had for keeping tools that was different from his but not worse. He took down a faded picture that had been on the wall for 10 years and replaced it with the small framed sampler she had brought from Ohio, and she did not ask him to take anything down, and he took the picture down because the wall should have something of hers on it, something that had traveled with her. The first spring of their marriage was warm, and the grass came early, and Amber Run ran full and clear. The sheep were growing toward their spring clip, and Olive had ordered another 20 ewes to expand the flock, because the first clip had sold well enough, and the credit was being paid down faster than planned, and because Olive Sheridan's ambitions for those 240 acres of hard ground were not small. She had hired a teenage boy from Callaway Cross named Sam Hewitt to help with the flock, a quiet, earnest 16-year-old who had a natural affinity for the sheep that Olive said was a gift. And Sam came out 3 days a week and learned whatever Olive chose to teach him with a diligence that reminded Isaiah of a younger version of himself. Isaiah, for his own part, had expanded his cattle operation by 40 head the previous autumn, financing it through a local bank in a transaction that 15 months earlier he would not have bothered with because there was no point in building something larger than one man could manage alone. The point had changed. On a morning in late April, Olive came to the kitchen where Isaiah was eating breakfast and stood in the doorway, and he looked at her and knew immediately, because she had a particular quality of stillness that she only had when something large was occupying her completely, and he put down his coffee. "There is going to be a child," she said. Isaiah stood up from the table slowly. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am quite certain," she said. She was watching him carefully, measuring his reaction with the precision she brought to everything. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she let out a long, slow breath against his shoulder, and he held her, just that, held her in the morning light that came through the kitchen window, and painted the herbs on the windowsill and the worn boards of the floor and the whole ordinary miraculous fact of this kitchen and this woman and this life that had grown up from silence and hard ground. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I was not sure how you would feel." He pulled back and looked at her. "Olive," he said. She looked back at him. "I'm going to feel about this," he said, choosing the words carefully because they needed to be right, "the way I feel about everything that has happened since April of last year, which is that it is the most important thing that has ever happened to me, and I did not know I was waiting for it." She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he felt her breathe. "Good," she said, in the tone she used for things that mattered most. The summer passed in the way that summers do when you are paying attention to them, full and warm and particular in each day, so that later you remember not the season but the specific moments. The evening Olive beat him at checkers for the 4th time in a row, and was gracious enough not to remark on it. The afternoon they found a red-tailed hawk nesting in the cottonwood stand on her southern border, and stood in companionable quiet watching it. The morning he woke at dawn, and she was already awake beside him, lying on her side watching the light change on the ceiling, and when he asked what she was thinking she said, "I was counting the things I am grateful for," and he said, "How many?" And she said, "I lost count," and he said, "Good," and she smiled. She continued working through the summer, checking on the flock, managing Sam's work, keeping records of the wool operation with the careful hand of a woman who has learned that the difference between success and failure in farming is sometimes just the quality of your records. Isaiah helped and she let him, and they had developed by now a way of working together on their 2 adjacent properties that was efficient and also, he thought, a form of conversation that suited them both. In September, when the cottonwood stand was going yellow and the mornings were cold, the first clip of the expanded flock sold for the best price Olive had yet received, and she paid off the remainder of the credit to the Laramie sheepman in full, and came home from the post office holding the receipt and looking at it with the expression of a person who has won something they were not certain they would win. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She put the receipt in the tin box on the shelf where she kept important documents, and then turned to him and said, "I would like to file a formal expansion of the claim. There is an adjacent parcel to the southwest 20 acres, unoccupied. It would put us against the better water table." "I know the parcel," he said. He had walked it years ago. "The soil was less hard and there was a reliable spring. It is a good idea." "I thought so," she said. "I wanted to make sure you agreed." "I almost always agree with you," he said. "You should know this by now." "You argue about the fence line," she said. "The fence line is a point of principle. It is a 6-inch discrepancy that has never mattered to anyone." "It matters to me," he said. She looked at him with the edge of laughter in her eyes that he had come to love perhaps more than anything. "You are a very stubborn man," she said. "You knew that in April of last year," he said. "I did," she admitted. "I decided to marry you anyway." "I am aware," he said. "It reflects well on you." She threw a dish towel at him and he caught it, and they were both laughing in the kitchen while the October light came through the window and the stove ticked with warmth, and outside the wind moved through the yellowing cottonwoods, and it was very good. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a cold, clear Tuesday morning, delivered by the doctor from Callaway Cross, who arrived in time and was competent and professional. The birth was hard. Isaiah sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours that were the longest of his life, including any hours in any war, and when the doctor came out and said everything was well, he had to sit down on the floor because his legs had made a decision without consulting him. They named the boy Thomas, for Isaiah's father, with the middle name James for Olive's father, who had been a farmer in Ohio and was now dead these 6 years. Thomas Isaiah James Sheridan was born on a Tuesday in November, 8 pounds and loud about it, and he had his mother's brown eyes and a quantity of dark hair that suggested strong opinions about the world from his first moments in it. Isaiah held him on the first afternoon, and the boy looked up at him with the unfocused but somehow alert gaze of a newborn, and Isaiah held him very carefully and thought about all the years between the Tennessee farm and this bedroom in Wyoming, and did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say, only the weight of the child in his arms and the sound of Olive's breathing resting in the room behind him. "He is serious," Olive said from the bed. "He has that look," Isaiah agreed. "He has your look," she said. "God help him," Isaiah said. She laughed quietly, carefully, because laughing when you have recently given birth is complicated. Thomas Sheridan grew through that first winter into a sturdy, wide-eyed creature who regarded the ranch and everything on it with the proprietorial interest of someone who intended to manage the whole operation as soon as he had the technical capacity to do so. He was attentive in a particular way from very early, turning toward sounds, watching faces with the focused observation of his mother and the settled patience of his father. And he was serious without being unhappy, which his parents found both recognizable and endearing. In the spring of 1884, when Thomas was 4 months old and able to be bundled against the cold for short periods, Isaiah began carrying him in the mornings when he did the rounds: horses, cattle count, fence check, with the boy tucked against his chest in the sling Olive had made from a length of cotton, and an instruction pamphlet she had sent for from a dry goods company in Cheyenne. Thomas regarded the horses with enormous interest and made sounds of approval at the cattle, which Isaiah reported to Olive as very promising. Olive's sheep operation that year was the most successful yet, 68 head going into the spring clip, an expanded paddock, and Sam Hewitt now working 4 days a week, and talking about saving up enough to file on a small claim of his own eventually, which both Isaiah and Olive encouraged with the earnestness of people who know what that particular ambition means. She applied for the 20-acre parcel to the southwest, and it was granted without complication, because the land office was different from the county commissioner, and this particular transaction had no one opposing it. The parcel had the spring she had hoped for, running clear and cold, and she began planning the construction of a proper sheep barn for the following winter. There were difficulties in those years that were not romantic and required simply the work of living through them. A drought in the summer of 1884 that hit the cattle hard and required Isaiah to sell 20 head earlier than he had planned. A lung infection that Thomas developed in February of 1885 that kept Olive and Isaiah both sleepless for 8 days before the boy's fever broke, and the doctor said the worst was past. A bad season of prices in 1885 that compressed what had been a comfortable margin and required them both to recalculate and adjust. These things they managed together, with the same directness and practicality and lack of panic that each of them had brought to their own separate lives and brought more effectively, it seemed, to their shared one. Garfield Prout died in the spring of 1885 heart failure, the county paper said, at the age of 61, and Isaiah heard the news from Sheriff Baird and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something more like the closing of a parenthesis. He told Olive. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "I do not wish him ill. I am glad, however, that it is over." Isaiah said he agreed. They did not speak of Prout again. The summer of 1885 was the summer Isaiah and Olive built the proper barn together, a real one, not the lean-to structure that had been serving the Sheridan cattle since the ranch began. They contracted for timber and spent 2 weeks at the framework with the help of 4 men from town, including Sam Hewitt, who was now 17 and doing most of the physical work of an adult. And the barn went up in the way that barns go up when people work with purpose and intention, beam by beam, rising from the flat ground into a solid, upright thing that would last. On the last evening of the barn raising, when the crew had gone home and the structure stood complete against the pink and orange Wyoming sunset, Isaiah and Olive stood in front of it with Thomas on Olive's hip, the boy at 1.5 years now and studying the barn with his usual proprietary air. "It is a good barn," Olive said. "It is," Isaiah agreed. Thomas pointed at it and made a sound that had been, for the past 2 weeks, his primary commentary on all construction. "He approves," Isaiah said. "He does," Olive said. She leaned her head against Isaiah's shoulder, briefly, the way she did sometimes at the end of a long day, not dramatic, not excessive, just the solid weight of her against him that meant she was tired and he was where she wanted to be tired. He put his arm around her, and they stood watching the last light go red on the new barn walls while Thomas pointed at things and informed them of his opinions, and the first stars came out over the Wyoming hills. In the autumn of 1885, Olive told him there would be a second child. Thomas was 18 months old and had strong opinions about being a king, and the second child, born in May of 1886, was a girl they named Ruth Eleanor Sheridan, who arrived with considerably less drama than Thomas had, faster and more efficient about the entire process, which the doctor noted approvingly. Ruth was from her first weeks a calmer, sunnier child than her brother. She looked at the world with an expression of benevolent interest rather than Thomas's calculating assessment, and she had Isaiah's gray-green eyes and Olive's auburn hair, and a smile that appeared early and often, and that Isaiah was privately helpless before. Thomas, presented with his sister with all the ceremony that a 19-month-old can muster, looked at her for a long time and then looked at his father and said, clearly and with great seriousness, "Mine," which Olive and Isaiah took to be a declaration of sibling ownership rather than any aggressive intent, and which Ruth seemed to accept as she accepted most things, with placid good humor. The years built themselves the way years do on land you have committed to, each one containing its own weathers and challenges and small and large joys, each one adding something to the structure that you cannot always see while it is happening, but that is visible, later, in the strength of what stands. Isaiah, at 38, was different from the man of 34 who had ridden his fence line alone in a silence he had mistaken for peace. He was not louder. He was still a man of few words, and Olive had never tried to change this, had in fact told him once that his silences were one of the things she had first noticed and respected about him, which was information he had held close. But the silence was different in quality, inhabited now, full of things rather than empty of them. He had people he was quiet with, and that made all the difference. He was also, it had to be said, better at checkers than he had been, because Olive played every week and losing to her repeatedly had eventually become an educational experience. He beat her sometimes now, which she regarded with a competitive ferocity that he found completely disproportionate and utterly charming. Olive at 31 was the woman she had been working toward being since she left Kansas with her hotel wages and her determination, and she was doing it on terms that were entirely her own, which was the thing that mattered to her most, and which Isaiah understood was not a small thing. Her sheep operation was the largest it had been, 92 head, a winter barn, a spring from the 20-acre parcel feeding a proper water system, a wool clip that had made her a known quantity among the wool buyers in Cheyenne and Laramie. She was respected in Callaway Cross in a way that had taken a year to earn, and that was solid now, built from practical competence, and the stubborn consistency of someone who does not make promises they will not keep. Sam Hewitt filed on a small claim at 20, 3 miles to the south, and Olive gave him 4 ewes as a foundation gift for his flock, and told him he would figure it out, and he did. And for years afterward he rode over to ask her things, and she always had an answer or a willingness to admit she did not and help him find one. In 1887, when Thomas was 3 and Ruth was 1, they expanded the ranch house, added 2 proper bedrooms and a porch that ran the full front length of the house, because the children needed space, and Olive had always believed that a porch was a form of philosophy. Isaiah built the porch in August, working early and late to finish it before the weather changed, and when he was done Olive brought 2 chairs out and they sat on it that first evening watching the sun go down over their combined land, 600 and some acres now, the Sheridan Ranch and the former Creel claim and the 20-acre parcel with the spring, all running together under one management and one understanding. "I owe you an apology," Olive said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For ruining your silence," she said. The edge of laughter was there and something warmer under it. "You did ruin it," he agreed. "Entirely." "I have no regrets," she said. He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and found her hand. She turned her palm up and he held it. "Neither do I," he said. "Not one." The stars were coming out one by one over the prairie in the way they did in a country without other lights, each one appearing as if being placed there deliberately, and the sound of Thomas's voice came from inside the house, some bedtime negotiation with the nature of which he was clearly on the losing side, and the lamp light from the window fell yellow across the new porch boards. An amber run was running somewhere in the dark behind them with its constant particular sound, and Isaiah Sheridan, who had been silent for 14 years, held his wife's hand on their porch in the Wyoming evening and felt the enormous and sufficient rightness of a life that had surprised him. He was a man who had stopped expecting to want things, and then a woman had moved onto the neighboring claim and changed the whole arrangement, and he found that he was grateful every ordinary day for the change. Olive squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and they sat as the dark came fully down, and the coyote started up somewhere on the hills to the north, and Thomas's negotiation inside reached its inevitable conclusion and went quiet, and they stayed on the porch for a long time, not needing to speak, the silence between them not empty anymore but full of everything they had built, and everyone they loved and all the particular days that had brought them here, to this porch, to this evening, to each other. Thomas grew into a boy who wanted, with the certainty of the very young and the very sure, to be a rancher, which surprised no one. He followed his father with the devotion of a purpose-built shadow from the time he was old enough to follow without falling over, and Isaiah taught him everything he knew about cattle and land, and the particular patience required to manage things that do not respond to hurry, and Thomas absorbed it all with his serious eyes and his mother's precision, and stored it somewhere that would serve him well. Ruth grew into a girl who could name every sheep on the property by sight, and who had, by the age of 4, convinced her father to let her name the troublesome one's most recent daughter, a heifer calf that Ruth named Marguerite in a decision that was not subject to revision, and who would spend hours with Olive among the sheep doing things that looked like nothing, but were in fact a very specific and productive form of attention. She had her father's calm and her mother's intelligence, and the combination was, Isaiah thought privately, going to be formidable. In the winter of 1888, a bad storm hit Callaway County with the kind of severity that reminded everyone that Wyoming's tolerance for human occupation was conditional. It hit in January and lasted 11 days, and the snow drifted 6 feet against the north side of the barn, and 3 of Isaiah's cattle were lost, and 2 of Olive's ewes froze in the night before they could be brought into the barn. They weathered it the way they weathered everything together, methodically, taking turns at the necessary work, keeping the children warm and the animals alive and each other functional. When the storm broke and the sky cleared on the 12th morning with that particular violent blue that follows disaster, they stood on the porch and surveyed the white and changed landscape, and Isaiah counted the losses and calculated, and Olive did the same beside him, and then she said, "We will recover it by summer." "Yes," he said. "The spring lamb crop will be strong," she said, "and the wool price is up. I may sell the North Pasture cattle in Cheyenne rather than Callaway Cross," he said. "The price differential is worth the drive." "I think so too," she said. Thomas appeared in the doorway in his coat and boots, at 4 years old, deeply invested in the situation, and said, "Can I see the barn?" "When it is less cold," Olive said. "It is not that cold," Thomas said, with the confidence of a person who has not yet fully learned what cold means in Wyoming in January. "It is extremely cold," Isaiah said. "Come inside." Thomas came inside. Ruth, from the warmth of the kitchen where she was engaged with a cloth doll of Olive's making, looked up at her brother's entrance and said something that was not quite language but had the tone of a question, and Thomas answered her seriously in the manner of an older sibling explaining the world, and Isaiah and Olive stood at the porch door and listened to their children and looked at each other. "We are doing all right," Olive said. "We are doing better than all right," Isaiah said. She put her arm through his. "Yes," she said, "we are doing better than all right." Spring came as it always did, unasked for and necessary, and the grass came back and the creek ran full, and the lamb crop was strong, 27 new lambs, most of them healthy, 3 of them requiring extra attention that Olive and Ruth provided with focused care. Ruth had by now an ability with sick animals that the doctor, who visited twice that spring for unrelated reasons, noted approvingly, and said he hoped she would find a use for it when she was grown, and Olive agreed that she would. Isaiah drove a portion of his cattle to Cheyenne in April and got the better price, and came home with the proceeds, and they put the storm losses behind them and looked forward. The ranch accounts, which Olive kept with her usual precision, showed a property that was more than holding its own, it was building. Every year it was a little stronger, a little more established, a little more what they had been working toward, which was a place that would outlast them and give their children something solid to stand on. The summer of 1889 was the year Wyoming Territory became Wyoming State, on a warm day in July, and the news came to Callaway Cross with considerable celebration. Isaiah and Olive rode into town for the announcement and stood in the main street among neighbors and acquaintances, and even a few people who had, in earlier years, been skeptical of Olive's sheep and her right to her own land on her own terms. Time and success have a way of settling arguments that evidence alone cannot always win, and Olive Sheridan was by now simply a fact of Callaway County in the way that established things become facts, visible and present and not requiring defense. She stood in the main street of Callaway Cross on the day Wyoming became a state, and listened to the speeches with Thomas on one side of her holding her hand and Ruth on the other side. And Isaiah stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder, and she felt the particular quality of belonging that she had left Ohio to find and had not found in Kansas, and had come to Wyoming and had built, acre by acre and year by year. From hard ground and determination and a neighbor who had helped her change an axle and had stayed. Later, walking back to where they had tied the horses, Thomas said, "Are we Wyomingites now?" "Wyomingites," Olive said, trying the word. "I believe the proper term is Wyomingites, yes. I have been one my whole life," Thomas said, with the satisfaction of someone who likes to have his status formalized. "You have," Isaiah agreed, "since before it was official." "That means I was one first," Thomas said. "So it does," Isaiah agreed. Ruth, at 3 years old and not entirely following the conversation, said, "Sheep," because the flock was visible from the edge of town, the white shapes of them moving in the afternoon light on the green hillside, and she pointed and looked pleased. "Sheep," Olive agreed. Isaiah caught Olive's eye over the children's heads, and she smiled at him and he smiled back, and there was everything in that exchange that the past 7 years had put there. The snowstorm and the fence and the fire and the courtroom hearing, and the long evenings of supper and the sound of Thomas being born, and the weight of Ruth against his shoulder, and the checkers games and the porch and the tablecloth from the chest and all of it, in that one look between them that only they could fully read. In the autumn of 1889, the first autumn of Wyoming statehood, Olive found she was expecting again, a third child, which arrived the following April in the shape of a boy they named Henry, for no family reason but simply because when they said it in the room after he was born, it sounded like him, and they both felt it immediately. Henry James Sheridan had red hair, which surprised both of them equally, and which the doctor said was entirely possible given the genetics available, and he arrived in the world making clear that he found the whole arrangement lively and interesting, and intended to investigate it thoroughly as soon as possible. Thomas, at 5, received Henry with the serious formality of someone taking on a responsibility. Ruth, at 4, was immediately charmed and would remain charmed for all the years ahead that she and Henry shared the business of being siblings, which is to say permanently, and with occasional disagreements. And Isaiah, holding Henry on the first evening while Olive slept the necessary sleep of a woman who had done something enormous, looked at this red-haired new person and thought about the 14 years of silence and the April morning with the broken axle and the snowstorm and all the accumulated distance between that man and this one. And he understood, finally and completely, what he had not understood when he was living it, that the silence had not been peace. That peace was this. That peace was the weight of a child, the sound of a sleeping wife, the barn that stood solid through Wyoming winters, the flock on the hillside, the name called across a fence line on a spring morning, the hand offered palm-up across a restaurant table in a small town in 1882. Peace was not the absence of everything. Peace was the presence of the right things. He sat with Henry until the boy slept, and then he set him gently in the cradle and went to stand in the bedroom doorway and looked at Olive, and she was not entirely asleep. She opened one eye and looked at him. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "More than all right." She closed her eye. He went back to the cradle and watched Henry breathe for a while. And outside the window the Wyoming night was clear and full of stars, and Amber Run was running in the dark, and the sheep were in their barn, and the cattle were in their pastures, and the new porch was solid under the spring sky. And the ranch that had been built from silence and stubbornness and 14 years of solitude was now something else entirely, something with voices in it and light in every window. And Isaiah Sheridan stood in the middle of it and was, beyond any argument he could have made to himself 8 years before, content. Olive recovered from Henry's birth with the efficiency she brought to everything. By May she was back at her usual work, with Sam Hewitt's help and the growing assistance of Thomas, who by 5 was already following the routines of the sheep operation with an attentiveness that suggested he would eventually have opinions about both sheep and cattle, which was perhaps unusual, but was unquestionably his inheritance. The spring clip that year was the best in the history of the operation. 104 sheep giving fine-grade wool that sold at the best price Olive had yet received. She put the figures in the account ledger in her careful hand, and then sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers for a long time. "Isaiah," she said, when he came in from the barn. He looked at her face and came and sat across from her. "We are doing very well," she said. She said it with a quality of wonder in it, not because she had doubted it exactly, but because there is a difference between the day-by-day knowledge that things are going forward and the moment you look at the record and see how far forward they have gone. "We are," he agreed. "I came here with hotel wages and 30 ewes and a tent," she said. "I remember," he said. "You helped me change an axle," she said. "It needed doing," he said. She looked at him across the table, across the years, across everything that was between them by now, and he looked back at her and she said, "Thank you." "Olive," he said. "I mean it," she said. "For all of it, for helping me when you did not have to, for being there when Prout came, for coming to the commissioner's office, for fixing the fence in the snow, for all the suppers, for staying." "Olive," he said again. "I know," she said. "You do not need the thanks, you never have, but I am telling you anyway." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "You came onto the neighboring claim and you fixed everything that was broken in my life, and you did it by being completely, consistently, entirely yourself and not asking permission from anyone. I do not need thanks either, but I am telling you anyway." She reached across the table and put her hand in his, and he held it, and they sat in the kitchen of the ranch house they had built together from a 4-room beginning, with the sounds of their children moving through the rooms around them, and the May light coming through the window and the herbs growing in their tin, cans on the sill, and the wool accounts showing numbers that meant security, and the deed to 600 acres of Wyoming land filed in both their names in the county office in Callaway Cross. Thomas came in through the back door at a run, stopped when he saw them and said, "What are you doing?" "Talking," Olive said. "About what?" Thomas said. "About being grateful," Isaiah said. Thomas considered this with his customary seriousness. Then he said, "For what?" "For everything," Isaiah said. He looked at his son and then at his wife. "Specifically for your mother coming onto the neighboring claim and ruining my silence." Olive laughed the open, unguarded laugh that had first undone him in an unroofed house on a May evening 7 years ago, and Thomas looked between his parents with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has learned that adults sometimes say things that do not fully make sense but mean something important anyway. "Ruining is bad," Thomas said. "Usually." "Not always," Isaiah said. "Come help me check on the lambs," Olive said to Thomas. "Your father is being sentimental." "What is sentimental?" Thomas asked, following her toward the door. "It means," Olive said with a glance back at Isaiah, "that he is thinking about how glad he is." Thomas appeared to find this sufficient and they went out the back, and Isaiah sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house for a moment, listening to the sounds outside, Thomas's voice asking about the lambs, Olive's answering, the sound of the sheep, the wind in the cottonwoods on the southern border, Henry making some small sound from his cradle in the back room, Ruth's running steps on the porch boards. He thought about the man he had been at 20, riding west with nothing but a horse and a direction, and the specific emptiness of someone who has lost the shape of the life they expected. He thought about the years of building alone, each fence post, each season, each silent morning on the porch watching the sun come up over his land. He had thought for a long time that the silence was enough. He had thought that land and work and solitude were sufficient architecture. He had been wrong, and he had never been more grateful to be wrong. He pushed back from the table and went outside to find his family. The ranch stood behind him in the Wyoming morning, solid and real and full of light, and the 600 acres of prairie and hard ground and sheep pasture and cattle grazing stretched in every direction. And somewhere in it were the woman he loved, and the children they had made, and the life that had grown from a broken axle and a snowstorm and a fence that needed mending. And Isaiah Sheridan walked out into the sunlight and went toward all of it. Toward the voices and the work and the beautiful, ordinary noise of a life lived fully. And the silence that had once been his whole world was behind him, closed and complete, and what was ahead was everything else.